A deal is done. The two main political parties agreed to back an accord to restore power sharing in Northern Ireland, ending a 3-year deadlock. And as Malta's Prime Minister prepares to step down following the murder of a journalist, we ask, can the next leader restore the country's reputation? Welcome to the programme. I'm Alistair Sandford. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the US believes it's likely that the Ukrainian International Airlines jet was shot down by an Iranian missile. He says Washington will await the results of an investigation before taking what he called appropriate actions. The US falls in behind Canada, Ukraine and the UK, who say intelligence shows it was highly likely a surface-to-air rocket was responsible. The US also announced a fresh wave of sanctions against Tehran, as Neil O'Reilly reports.
A flash in the sky near Tehran, a moment perhaps with catastrophic consequences. Euronews can confirm this video, originally obtained by the New York Times, was filmed over the crash site. For many in the West and in Ukraine, it confirms the theory that the Ukraine Airlines jet was brought down by a missile, a theory dismissed by Iran.
No missile hit the plane. As I mentioned before, the plane was on fire for more than a minute and a half. And we understood that the pilot tried to return to the airport.
But the Iranian accident investigators can't at this stage offer an explanation for why the plane was suddenly engulfed in fire. State TV showed footage, not independently verified, of what it claims are the recovered flight recorders.
In normal conditions, we have the capacity to read the data of the flight recorders. If, for some reason, the recorders are damaged and we're unable to read them, then definitely we'll ask other countries for help, as it's a very common way of doing things and it happens everywhere.
Canada will be keen to offer its assistance. Many Canadians were on board.
We have intelligence from multiple sources, including our allies and our own intelligence. The evidence indicates that the plane was shot down by an Iranian surface-to-air missile. This may well have been unintentional.
Ukrainian experts are already in Tehran as part of the inquiry. Their early findings will be keenly awaited. Neil O'Reilly, Euronews.
Officials in Ukraine say they're looking at two possible causes for the fatal crash, as NBC News chief global correspondent Bill Neely reports from Kiev.
Yes, hi Alistair. Some interesting developments on the ground here in Kiev. I've been speaking this evening with the Ukrainian Foreign Minister Vadim Prystaiko, and he has talked about the team, the large team, around 45 experts and analysts and investigators that Ukraine has on the ground in Iran. It's significant because it's the biggest team that's there, and it is, if you like, the eyes of the world apart from the Iranians in the investigation at the moment. And he says Ukraine's investigators have been able to look at the debris from the plane. They have been able to look at the bodies and the body parts. They have been able to take samples and chemical residues. And they've also been able to see the black box flight recorder, which Iran says today it began trying to get data from. So it's significant that the Ukrainians are on the ground. The foreign minister told me that it's too early so far for Ukraine to say exactly what it believes happened, and it would like those black box flight recorders to be brought here to Kiev to be analysed. Also here in Kiev, Ukraine's Security and Intelligence Service has said that it is prioritising just two theories. Number one, the possibility of a missile attack, and number two, the possibility of a terror attack, an explosion inside the plane. Now, it's not surprising, if you like, that the intelligence service would be prioritising those two things, because they're not aviation or mechanical experts, so they wouldn't perhaps be investigating mechanical failure. But for what it's worth, that is what the Ukrainian Security Service is doing. Also, another minister said today that in all, there were 7 possible theories as to why this plane came down.
Canada's Prime Minister Justin Trudeau wants full access to the crash site to be granted to Canadian investigators. 63 Canadians were killed when flight PS 3752 went down. But former head of the Canadian mission in Tehran, Denis Horak, told me earlier that its relationship with Iran could hamper Canada's ability to get answers to what happened.
It's going to be very difficult. We closed our embassy in 2012 and we have no diplomatic relations with Iran. So that's going to be a challenge, certainly on the consular side, trying to get consular officials into Iran to try and deal with the families who are there and the families who want to repatriate the remains of their loved ones. So it's going to be very challenging because we're just not present on the ground. We'll hopefully be able to rely on our allies until we can get people there, and hopefully that the Iranians will allow Canadian consular officials access, provide visas, etc. They've said they were going to, and I hope that they stick to their word, but in my experience, that's not always been the case.
And you were head of mission there in Tehran. From your experience and knowing the Iranians, if it does turn out to be an Iranian missile that was behind this, what's the likelihood of Tehran acknowledging that?
I think it's very unlikely. They don't do transparency very well. The idea that they would have made an error, and I do believe if it was shot down that it was an error, I don't believe it would have been intentional. I would see no reason why it would be. But they don't admit mistakes very, very easily. This would have involved security forces, likely Revolutionary Guard forces. To admit that they made a mistake, I think would be something that would be very difficult for them to do. We've already seen them lay out what they believe is the issue, even before seemingly the investigation has been conducted, and certainly before it's been concluded. So I think we've gotten a sense on where they're going to go on this, and so I think it's very unlikely they'll admit.
Europe's foreign ministers are calling for a de-escalation of tensions in the Middle East, but say they plan to stand by the Iran nuclear deal signed in 2015. EU Foreign Affairs Chief Josep Borrell confirmed the bloc will not give up on the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, set up to control Iran's nuclear program. President Donald Trump wants the EU to abandon it, as he did in May 2018. But following Friday's emergency talks in Brussels, Mr. Borrell outlined the importance of the deal.
Without the JCPOA, today Iran would be a nuclear power. Thanks to this deal, Iran is not a nuclear power. And we strongly believe that it is in our interest to preserve the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action as far as we can. We call on Iran to go back to full compliance with the JCPOA without delay.
From Brussels, Shona Murray told me that the EU is facing an uphill battle to save the JCPOA.
As you heard there from Josep Borrell, the EU is steadfast behind the JCPOA, has called on Iran to get back to the table. As we heard during the week, Iran said it was going to withdraw from the JCPOA. It had already started breaching the limits of the deal when the United States said it was pulling out of it back in 2018. It's known as a huge foreign policy success for the EU, for the UN, for the United States. And Josep Borrell also made the point there that it's the only thing that keeps nuclear weapons off the table from Iran. So it's absolutely worth preserving. On the other hand, we heard, like I said there, Iran was pulling out. The US wants nothing more to do with it. There was no new ideas today at that meeting as to how best to salvage the deal. For example, I even asked Josep Borrell, for example, would they even consider re-engineering the deal so that you could get the United States back on side, for example. There was nothing like that. The EU's position is that the JCPOA was meticulously negotiated. It's incredibly technical. It took several years. And the one that's on the table, the one that was signed in 2015, that's the one that the EU wants to support.
And the calls from the EU for the tensions to be de-escalated between Iran and the US, are they having any effect?
Well, the EU, Josep Borrell, again, in that press conference just a little while ago, said that really the region, in particular Iraq, of course, which is caught between the US and Iran in this, can't afford another war. And at the same time, NATO, many EU member states have troops in Iraq. in the fight against ISIS, training local militias. But the EU said that it will take some of the credit, I suppose, for de-escalating the tensions over the last week, because as we saw at the start, just this day last week, nobody knew how the hostilities would, increase or not. We heard from Germany's Foreign Minister Heiko Maas saying that the EU can, and that it was the EU's role in intervening on both sides and being a conduit for both sides that has allowed things to settle somewhat, and that the EU would maintain this role in the coming weeks, months and years.
Shona Murray in Brussels.